Hi. As I made this recipe, I used my recently acquired data logger to test it, and I learned something very interesting, which changes the timing that I give you in the middle of the video. So please watch this whole video, and I will provide links and the data and tell you what I learned. Hi, I'm Beth, creator of dryitcanit.com. I like to share with you tips and tricks for dehydrating food, canning food, as well as share original recipes that I put together. Today I want to talk about canning soup, particularly chicken noodle soup. Now, noodles are one of those things that are not an approved method because it hasn't really been tested with the USDA. So if you're a canner that wants to go strictly by what the USDA has tested, this isn't for you. That said, this recipe works really well. I believe it's 100% safe, and as we go through this video, I'll explain why. So I'm going to do this video showing you, first of all, how to make the chicken stock from scratch. Now, if you don't have chicken bones, you can use something like a chicken broth, and I actually will use this to supplement what I have. But doing it from scratch, from the bones, is really the way to go. What you end up with is this somewhat flavorful but gelatinous substance that really adds body to your soup. So it's super easy, and I'm going to show you how to get going. So what I do is I generally will use 1 carrot, 1 onion, and usually 1 stalk of celery. I don't have any celery today, so I'm going to add some celery seed. So it's almost a mirepoix, but not really in the traditional sense. So the carrot I completely washed. I didn't peel. I do cut off the stem end and get rid of that. And then basically I just sort of cut this into about 3 pieces, throw it into my pot. With the onion, again, I'm not really going to worry about chopping it. I just want to peel it and get rid of the peels. So the thing about making homemade chicken stock is that you get something that is, I guess, maybe more flavorful, and somehow it just adds a lot to the soup. And you can do this same method to make beef stock. You can use the bones from beef roast or maybe steaks, I'm not really sure. But beef bones, soup bones is usually what I will buy. You can get those at a meat market even often. So I just basically peeled my onions. I keep the root end on, and that kind of keeps it intact. And then I just basically quarter it, and then again I throw it into the pot. Now, if I had the celery, I would wash the celery well, and I would chop that celery stick, 1 good stick. I'd leave the leaves on it. I just trim that root end a little bit, cut that celery stalk into about 3 pieces. Because I'm going to use celery seed today, I'm just going to use a handful, which is probably about a teaspoonful, and I'm going to throw that in there. So again, super easy. Now this is really almost a 24, certainly a 12-hour thing, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. Then we had chicken for dinner last night. I have leftover chicken, and what I want to do is, we basically ate the pieces with the bones, and we just saved those afterwards. Some of them have a little bit of meat on, and we're just going to take those bones. I've pulled the meat off as much as I reasonably can, and taking those bones and just throwing those into the pot. What this is really going to do is pull the marrow, if you will, out of the bones, and that really makes for a nice stock. So I have my carrots, my celery seed in this particular case, onion, and my chicken bones in here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to cover this with water. I'm going to fill this up so that there's about 1 inch of water over this, and I'm actually going to put it in my Instant Pot for 40 minutes. I'm going to let it decompress naturally, and then I'm going to let it cool, and then I'm going to put it in the refrigerator overnight. And tomorrow morning I'm going to be back and show you why I do that and why it's important. If you don't have an Instant Pot, go ahead and just use a regular pot for your stove. Again, fill the pot full, not full, but bring the water up about 1 inch, maybe 1.5 inches above what your bones and everything are. Put the cover on it and bring it up to boil. Once it boils, turn it down to simmer and simmer it for 2 to 3 hours. Shut off the pot, let it cool to room temperature, put it in the refrigerator overnight. I'm going to show you why that makes a difference tomorrow, and I will show you what we get and what we do with it. So I'm gonna get the broth going here, and I will be back tomorrow to show you the results of that and what the next steps are. Stay tuned because we're gonna have a really good chicken noodle soup when we're done. In the meantime, if you can hit the subscribe button below, that would be awesome. If you like what you've seen so far, thumbs up helps me know what it is that you're looking for. So stay tuned for tomorrow, and we'll proceed with the broth to make and can the chicken noodle soup. Yesterday I showed you how I make my broth, or bone broth is what a lot of people call this. And I cooked this, covering the bones and my aromatics, my carrot, my onion, my celery seeds, since I didn't have celery. Cooked that, mine in the Instant Pot for about 40 minutes. You put it on your stove for 2 or 3 hours, and then refrigerate it overnight. That's gonna do a couple things for you. Depending upon your chicken, you may or may not have a lot of fat, and the fat will float to the top when you refrigerate it. Now, I don't have a lot of fat on this particular chicken, but when you do, oftentimes you'll have almost a solid piece of fat. I have a little bit here, I don't know if you can see that, and I just sort of take that off and put that in the garbage. If you have a lot of fat in your chicken, you'll actually maybe have a sheet that you'll be able to pick out and pick up and put away. Some people will can with the fat. You certainly can do that if you want to. I just think the flavor is better and the soup is less greasy to remove most of it. So that's something that I routinely do. Now you're probably not going to get all of it out. You're probably going to have bits and pieces of it still floating around, and that's okay. But you want to get the bulk of it. But what you're left with, and this is actually more liquid than it usually is, but it's slightly gelatinous. And this is actually quite a bit more liquid than I usually have. Usually it's much more like a jello on top. And I can't really demonstrate that here because you can't really see the difference, but it is thicker than water, if that makes any sense. Oftentimes you're gonna have something that's really more like a gelatin, a loose gelatin. Think of it as loose jello. And that's what you're going for, so that's good. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my broth and I'm going to be heating that up with whatever I'm going to put into my soup. Now, I'm choosing to use my Instant Pot again. But again, you can put this in a great big pot and start heating it up that way with whatever you're going to add. So I have here, let's see here, what do I have? About 8 cups, not quite 8 cups of homemade broth, homemade chicken broth, or bone broth as a lot of people call it. And that gives me a really good start on my homemade chicken noodle soup. Now, I'll routinely add another quart of chicken broth, purchased chicken broth. Again, it's going to give me more flavor, it's going to give me more liquid, and that liquid's going to be important, particularly when I add my noodles. Now, the noodles I use are really the secret to this recipe because I found a noodle that works really, really well. It cans beautifully, it does not disintegrate, it does not turn to mush, it just works out really well. So stay with me here as I work through this. Now, to your broth, you're going to add whatever you want to add to it. At this point in time, it's not going to have a ton of chicken flavor. I choose to add in this amount, which is, let's see, I had 8 cups and then another quart, so however much that is, my math isn't doing, about 12 cups of liquid here. I'm going to add a carrot, which I'm going to wash, peel, and slice. You can chop it if you prefer. Don't have to add carrot if you don't want. I'm going to use another onion. I'm going to use some dehydrated celery because I don't have fresh celery. If I had fresh celery, I would use 1 to 2 stalks of fresh celery chopped. Now, why didn't I use the dehydrated celery yesterday in the stock? To be honest with you, my dehydrated foods I like to use in the food that I'm actually going to eat. I don't like to do it for flavoring. The celery seeds serve the same purpose. But I'm going to add a nice handful of dehydrated celery, and I don't have to rehydrate that because that's going to cook in here. And then I'm going to get that part prepped. I'm also going to add some dehydrated parsley because I like parsley in mine. And then at that point, I'm going to taste my broth and see what I want to do. I typically am going to add some bouillon or some chicken powder. Either one of these are fine. Think about this, the bouillon cubes, maybe 1 cube per cup and a half of water. Chicken powder, teaspoon, 2 teaspoons. This is more concentrated. I think it goes a long way. You don't have to do that. I think it just enhances the chicken flavor. And then you can do the salt and the pepper, you know, to taste. So I am going to prep these things, get these ready to go, and then I'm going to be back and I'm going to show you what I do, not only for the next steps, but the noodles that I use, and then walk you through the process for canning. The times on canning soup are a little bit different, even though I'm going to have meat. So stay with me. My vegetables are chopped. Again, I just used 1 carrot and 1 onion. You can use whatever vegetables or whatever quantities you want to use. This is just what I like, or what we like in our family. If you want to dice your carrots, go ahead and dice them. I just like them sliced. Then I'm going to use a good handful, so to speak, of parsley. If you dehydrate vegetables or your herbs, this is a great use for them. I usually vacuum seal them when I'm done, but I'm just going to take a handful like so and put that in there. And again, it's subjective. What if you put in what you want to put in. There are some quantities that I'm going to want to go with. Now, I'm going to give that a quick stir, like so, and it's starting to look like soup. And then I know that I'm going to add some chicken flavoring, just because I want chicken flavoring for chicken soup. I don't add my meat until after everything's heated because I think it dries out the meat. But of course, the meat does get pressure canned, but I find it stays really pretty well with that. So I'm going to add a couple of spoonfuls of the chicken powder. Now, sometimes less is more. In other words, if you get too much, you get too much. So I'm going to give the powder a quick stir. You can definitely use the bouillon cubes. Obviously, you can't taste your broth then at that point. So I'm just going to give this a stir. The powder, it has a few clumps in when you put it this way, but it's okay. And it needs a little bit more. And I'm going to have a little bit more than I normally would have if I was going to eat it right away, because the noodles are going to take up some of this space, so to speak, and dilute some of that flavoring a little bit. Now you can add some of this chicken flavoring on the back end when you're heating up your soup too, if you prefer. I'm going to do a good sprinkling of pepper in here. I'm not going to add salt because there's a lot of salt in the bouillon and I can always salt on the back end. Now, here's my secret trick. These noodles are the best noodles for homemade chicken noodle soup. Not homemade noodles, but they're in the frozen section of your grocery store. They're Reams egg noodles. It's Reams, R-E-A-M-E-S. They're home style egg noodles. I've been using these for years. They work out really, really well for pressure can soup. They don't get gummy, they don't get sticky, they don't get soft and mushy. They just hold up really well. So what I typically do is I take these out of the freezer and put them in the refrigerator to let them thaw, but they're still cold. And then I find for this amount of broth, about half a package works pretty well. It won't look like a lot, but these do fluff up a little bit, so to speak. So I'm going to add about a half a package of the noodles directly into my bowl here. And if you were doing this on the stove, again, what you're going to do is you're going to end up bringing all of this to a boil, and you're going to cook these noodles for about 20 minutes. Now I'm going to show you what these noodles look like. They're a little bit sticky when you have them in here, but they're just egg noodles, just plain and simple. So you're going to cook those for about 20 minutes on the stove. Bring your broth and everything to a boil. Turn it down to simmer it for about 20 minutes. I'm doing mine.
This is my Instant Pot, so not my canner. As I heat my stock and my ingredients, I'm using the Instant Pot. Sorry about that mistake.
Primarily because it's quick, it's easy, and I have a bigger pot than I do otherwise. And I can put this in the dishwasher, quite frankly, too, whereas I can't with my pot. So my next step is to go ahead and put this in my pressure canner. You go ahead and put it on your stove, your cooktop stove. I do want to make sure that you come back because I want to talk about how we can this in terms of time and in terms of proportion to broth and solids also. So stay tuned, and again, subscribe, hit the subscribe button below so that you get notified when I have new videos showing things. You can choose to watch the video, choose not to watch the video, but it's a great way to know what I'm doing. So
again, this part is the Instant Pot,
not the canner. You
canner.
go ahead and get yours on the stovetop, and then we'll talk about how to can this up. I've cooked my chicken stock in the Instant Pot. I let it cook really for its time, and let those noodles cook, and then I let it decompress, and now I'm good to go here pretty much. Now, what I'm going to do the last thing is I have about 2 cups of chopped chicken here, which is what I had left, and I'm going to add that to my hot broth, and then I'm going to put my cover back on, and I'm going to let that sit for about 10 minutes. The reason I'm going to do that, I'm not going to be able to turn that with the valve there. The reason I'm going to do that is I want the chicken to get warmed up before I can that. If you did your stock or broth on the stove, shut off your stove at the end, put your chicken in there, cover it, and let it sit for about 10 minutes. Because we want to work with basically hot broth, hot vegetables, hot chicken, and before we start canning. Now, technically, chicken stock is when you make it with the bones, which is what I did. If you don't want to make your stock from scratch, you can use multiple cartons of chicken stock or chicken broth that you can buy in the store, canned, boxed, whatever you want to do, that works fine. I did realize after I was cleaning up after the video just prior to this one that I had forgot to add my celery. So I quickly opened up my pot and I put a handful of celery in there, the dehydrated celery, about the same amount I did of the parsley. So I'd say about a 1/4 cup of the dehydrated celery. Again, the quantities, the amounts, it's okay if they vary a little bit. So I'm going to let this sit for 10 minutes, then we're going to go ahead and start putting our chicken stock and our noodles into the jars, and we're going to talk about timing for that. I'm ready to go ahead and put some homemade chicken noodle soup into my jars so that I can pressure can that. So what I'm going to do basically is I had my jars heating as this was finishing, took a hot jar, and then I'm going to go ahead and just basically fill this jar up to about 1 inch of head space. So I'm going to have a combination obviously of solids and liquids, and I'm just going to fill this up, each of the jars, to the 1 inch head space. Now, here's the thing with when you're canning soup. Even though this has meat in it, when you're doing soup, you can actually do 60 minutes for pints and 75 minutes for quarts. Now, that assumes that you're doing broth or stock and vegetables or meat and beans or whatever is sanctioned, so to speak. Keep in mind that I'm doing noodles, and noodles are not sanctioned in that they're not tested. So this is a little bit of a rebel recipe. For that reason, I'm actually going to pressure can my quarts for 90 minutes. And any pints that I do, I usually do for 75 minutes. And that's just because the noodles are in there and I want to take that extra step. That said, you definitely want to have, probably about 1/3 to 1/2 in solids, and not more than that. You want your broth to be there to get the temperature up. So you can see where I have filled this, and that's going to go into my pressure canner, like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and do the next jars. You want to keep your jars inside of your canner, keep them hot until you're ready to fill them. Somebody asked me once, why do you put your jars on a towel? Honestly, the reason for that, and I tend to take them off afterwards when I'm filling, is because your jars are really hot and sometimes your counters are cold and you just don't want that temperature difference. That said, usually it seems like after I have it for a minute or so, it's fine. So I'm just going to keep filling each of my jars up, and then I'll come back and talk to you for just a little bit about the canning on this. If you're doing soup with seafood, then you need to pressure can for 100 minutes for quarts. I don't remember what the time is for pints on that. But the key, again, is to make sure that your solids are really no more than half of your jar. In this particular case, these noodles typically thicken up a little bit and feel a little bit more of the capacity once they're pressure canned. So that's something to kind of keep in mind also as I'm adding my broth. So I'm going to continue putting the soup into my jars. I'm going to wipe off the jars. I am using vinegar again today, simply because I have meat in here and you have the fat from the chicken, and I want to make sure that each of my jars are clean, the lids are clean, or the rims are clean before I put the lids on. So let me finish these jars up and I will be right back. I filled all my jars and they're now in my canner. And again, I'm canning them for 90
Please
minutes.
keep watching this video because my data logger revealed a change in
I
time.
could do those for 75 minutes. My yield on this was 7 pints because I'm doing quarts. Basically, I have 3 quarts and another pint approximately left over here, which frankly is going to be a bowl of soup for me tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and pressure can these. I'm going to let them rest overnight once the pressure canning is done, and I'll be back in the morning to wrap this up. So again, homemade chicken noodle soup, pressure canned, delicious. The secret is to get the good egg noodles. And these are not the egg noodles that you get in the store where the noodles are much like a macaroni noodle. It's the egg noodles that are frozen that really make this recipe. So stay tuned as I wrap this up. My chicken noodle soup has sat overnight and I have my 3 quarts of soup. I had an extra pint. I had that for dinner last night. The soup turned out really well. You can see the noodles, you can see the broth, the celery, the parsley, the chicken, everything in it. As is typical when I use these egg noodles, the noodles soak up some of the broth. And that happens. That's kind of what makes those noodles so good. But as much as I have always done this and been really comfortable with it being safe, and it still is, bear with me, this was the first time I used my data logger to make the soup. And I learned something about the data that is going to cause me to adjust the timing on this for the directions, the printed directions that I will make available to you. And it's different than what I said in this video earlier. So I want to give you a close-up of this data and explain to you what I found and what I learned. I used my data logger for the first time because I only bought that earlier this summer. But what it does is it logs temperature, and I'm using Fahrenheit, and it logs time that I made this. So what I learned is that by doing the quarts, like I always have for the full 90 minutes, look how long it's over that 240 degree mark. 1 hour and 18 minutes, way longer than it needs to be. And what I'm going to do is adjust this recipe so that in the future I'm using regular soup times, which is going to be 60 minutes for pints and 75 minutes for quarts. When I look at the data and I look at my times, I know that from the time I start, I can get to that 240 degree mark, and if I go by the 75-minute time, it gets me to about here. But I also know, and you'll know this if you watch some of my other videos when I do use my data logger, that at the time my pressure canner shuts off, the temperature still stays up there for quite a period of time before it drops down. So I know that I will have plenty of time in that 240 degree mark. So technically, I've been canning this too long and I'm going to cut this back. So going forward, I'm going to use soup times on my chicken noodle soup. Now again, I tested this with Ream's egg noodles. It's the only kind of noodles I use when I make chicken noodle soup. But it turns out really well, even at the long times. I don't know if you can see this, but you've got the egg noodles, the chicken, the carrots. And it is so good. I wish you could have smelled my kitchen as I was pressure canning and it was venting. It smelled like roasted chicken, and I couldn't quite figure out how that happened because there was no sign of siphoning on my jars. But anyway, again, I do want to remind you that noodles and rice are not something that are tested and thereby approved. But I think that my data shows that for at least my family, I'm more than comfortable with this. I'm more than comfortable. It gets into the zone that would eliminate the possibility of botulism. You need to do what you want to do for your family. I'm going to post the recipe for this chicken noodle soup that I use, that I make. I think you can use your own recipe. I think the key is to make sure that when you're filling your solids, don't fill your jars more than about half full and fill the rest with broth. That's really important. Get the temperatures to where they need to be. So I hope you learned something. I hope you try and make some chicken noodle soup. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe by hitting the subscribe button below. Thanks for watching. Happy canning, happy dehydrating.